My name is Karen Fabian and I'm the founder of Bare Bones Yoga, and I want to welcome you to my YouTube channel and a quick video about how to bring anatomy into your teaching. So if you're watching this and you're a yoga teacher and you have a good handle on anatomy but you're looking for ways to share it with your students, I'm going to give you a way to share something meaningful about the anatomy of the knee. And this really relates to some of the poses that we commonly do in yoga, where we take the knee out of its most comfortable position from the perspective of the joint. And I actually started my class recently with this theme, and sometimes I like to do that when I come in to the studio, when I come into the room, to the practice area. I'll start with just a quick conversation with people about a particular aspect of anatomy, and this way, you know, they're sitting comfortably, they're focused on listening, and it gives them an opportunity to kind of understand the concept from an intellectual perspective, from an academic perspective. And then when we start to move, I call back on this theme in different ways. So it could be in a particular movement, it could be in a specific pose, and I'll reference back to what I shared at the beginning of class. And so I find this can be a really helpful way for students to learn, because they understand it more from just kind of sitting and hearing about it, and then putting it into practice in the body. And this can also be a really effective way for yoga teachers to share their knowledge of anatomy, and in a way to really test their knowledge of anatomy. It's one thing to understand the bones and the muscles and the joints and be able to spout them off from a memorization standpoint, and that's good, and that's the first part. But what we really want to do is get to a point where the knowledge that we have can be applied to the actual practice of yoga, and we can start to call on that knowledge in many different ways. And this is kind of reinforcing the learning. So let me get to kind of the conversation I had. So I started out by asking the class if they understood the difference between the hip joint and the knee joint. And, you know, there really wasn't a lot of looks that gave me the sense that people got what I was looking for. And so then I said, well, what's the similarity between the hip joint and the shoulder joint? And then I got a lot of responses that it's a ball shape. So people knew kind of half of it. So I went on to describe the ball and socket joint type of both the shoulder and the hip, and some of the actions that that kind of joint allows us to do. So it allows us to both flex and extend and abduct and adduct, and externally and internally rotate. We certainly do all those movements in yoga, and while we might not use those terms, we might say something like open the hip. What we're literally doing is externally rotating. And so then I started to ask them if they understood the kind of joint that the knee was. And so when we look at the ball and socket of the hip, and then we travel down to the knee, we can see pretty clearly there's no ball and socket there. There's a roundness to the bottom part of the femur, the condyles, and they do sit in the tibia here in these little kind of cup-like things, but certainly not to the extent that you see the ball and socket orientation of the shoulder and the hip. And so what we find in the knee is that it's a hinge joint, just like the hinge on a door, and it really prefers and moves a lot more easily in this flexion and extension plane. But it's a little bit tricky because it does move side to side as well, and we know from moving the shin side to side that there is a little bit of a pivoting orientation between the femur and the tibia and the fibula, and so we can move the knee this way as well, and it's demonstrated by the lateral and medial movement of the lower leg bones. But we have to, you know, kind of the point of bringing this up is, if we're going to do poses where both the hip and the knee are moving, wouldn't it be better, and wouldn't it be healthier and safer and more kind of in keeping in mind with long-term joint health, to open the hip from the hip itself versus from the knee? Now that might intellectually make sense, but how do we apply it to yoga? Well, think about a posture where we're opening the hip, and as a result of opening the hip, the knee is moving. But if we were not aware of the difference in these joint types, we might just shove the knee. Rather rather than leveraging the smooth gliding and the orientation of these two bones, let's say the head of the femur and the cup of the pelvis, right? So we're talking about, that connection here. And this acetabulum cup holds the head of the femur. And if we aren't really moving from that part of the leg, it's really easy to just move from the knee and overdo the leveraging of the knee's ability to move in that way. It doesn't move as well that way as the hip does. The other interesting thing to think about is, because this joint is higher up in the chain, from a kinetic chain, a movement chain perspective, what this joint does, this joint's going to follow. So if I open my hip, my knee's going to open. It'd be kind of hard to open my hip and turn my knee in, right? So how does this all show up in a pose? Well, let's take a pose like standing half pigeon. Right here, my relationship to gravity is I'm pretty open. I'm not close to the floor. I'm standing up. I'm working in concert with gravity. So the risk is kind of low to the knee itself, even though I'm taking the knee out of its comfortable position of flexion and extension in this sagittal plane. But what if I take this same pose and I put it on the ground and I try to open the hip by just shoving the shin forward? If I don't have enough movement here, I'm trying to have it all come from here. And this joint is just not meant to move in that way as easily as this joint is. And now, as I come into it, and I see this quite a bit, people coming down, and now I'm trying to just put all this pressure on the internal, the medial aspect of the knee as I come down and try to keep that hip open. Well, you can imagine over time that puts a lot of undue pressure on the inside of the knee, and it's just not good for long-term health. And oftentimes, it just comes from a lack of understanding of what the orientation of these joints is. So that's just a quick suggestion for how you can bring anatomy into your teaching and to share something really helpful with your students. Again, we can kind of go into the studio and do all the things, but if we're not sharing this anatomical information, we're really leaving them at a disadvantage. So something like this gives people a way to really understand human anatomy, and as it applies to movement, how to move safely. So let me give you a couple things in closing. If this kind of information is interesting to you, you might be interested in learning more as a yoga teacher about anatomy. So I've got two resources here. I have my book on Amazon and on my website called Structure and Spirit, which breaks down anatomical themes and spiritual themes of yoga. And then even more applicable is my 200-page anatomy manual. And this breaks down bones, joints, muscles and poses, and then applying anatomy to practical scenarios in yoga teaching, because that's really where the rubber meets the road. So this is on my website, and you can purchase this direct right on the website for $65. And when you're on that books page, you're going to see this book, and the link will direct you to Amazon, and the Structure and Spirit book is $31.99. Along with that, if you visit the website, barebonesyoga.com, and I'll put that in the link below in the description, you can take my Learn Yoga Challenge, and that's right on the home page. It's a free video series which will walk you through several key aspects of anatomy in the context of practice and give you 8 free videos, including one that talks about foam rolling, which if you're going to the gym, you may be doing that and you may not really understand what you're doing. So I break that down for you. I give you the free videos about the sequence, what's happening in the body from an anatomical perspective. So the Learn Yoga Challenge is right there on my homepage of the website, barebonesyoga.com, and you can sign up for that, download the instruction guide, and take the challenge by going through the 8 free videos. So I hope you've enjoyed this. If you have any comments, please include them below, and any questions, send me an email. Thanks so much for watching. Namaste.